Everyone, thank you for coming to this event. I want to start by thanking Allie Laughlin of the PPE for working with me and all the panelists to organize this event. I know it was a lot more work than I realized because Allie creates a firewall and just gets everything done, so thank you for that. I want to welcome all of you to this final event in the Democracy Project's book series called Imagining Democracy. The series title could have been the name of the book we are all gathered to discuss. But before I introduce the panelists and our guest of honor for today, I want to say a few words about the project that is the occasion of our conversation and our gathering here. So I will share that I hadn't fully entered into this book, even though it came out a few months ago, because I was busy and it didn't seem pressing. It was in the pile. I moved it right up as soon as we decided on this event. I'm thrilled that I did. I can also tell you that it is as good a listen as it is a read, because I have been taking it in through both those senses appropriately, I think, for the arguments of the book. The Darkened Light of Faith is many things, and one of them is a contribution to perfectionism, which the author takes to be a shared project of the thinkers he wants to think with and or a necessary feature of any truly democratic life, a life in which we are all treated and treat each other with mutual respect and equal regard, aspirationally so. This aspiration is the North Star, as it were, of the book, and it guides all the thinkers in his book, Melvin Rogers argues. Now, this way of framing and phrasing the project as perfectionist is a contribution to a tradition, or can be seen as one, to a tradition of Black Emersonianism. Emerson indeed is quoted in the book, of course, and that tradition of Black Emersonianism has been called for by Bob Gooding Williams, so it struck me. Emerson is quoted in the book, as I said. I want to add another quote that I don't think is there, unless I missed it, from Self-Reliance, where Emerson says, quote, "The voyage of the best ship is a zigzag line of 100 tacks. See the line from a sufficient distance and it straightens itself to the average tendency. Your genuine action will explain your other genuine actions. Your conformity explains nothing," unquote. Then there is this from Foucault in his interview on friendship, where he says about homosexuality that it is, quote, "a slantwise position from which we can, quote, reopen affective and relational virtualities, not so much through the intrinsic qualities of the homosexual, but because of the slantwise position whose diagonal lines allow these virtualities to come to light." So another zigzag then. As I read this text by Melvin Rogers, the members of the profound Black critical archive he assembles are joined by this idea of the zigzag as a trait of perfectionism. For me, Emerson's image of a zigzag line of 100 tacks is inspiring, as is the idea that it can appear in all its perfection when we arrive right, if we ever catch up with our aspirational selves and our aspirational democracy. I want to say, as well implied by this argument of Melvin Rogers, is the idea of what I take to be the aspirational university. And I say that in solidarity with the students' encampment at Brown for Gaza. There is in that encampment also an appeal. We will zigzag today, I'm sure, in our conversation about the various conditions and rewards of a more truly democratic life, but zigzagging is how we get somewhere. And fortunately, in his book, Melvin Rogers endorses, quote, "critical responsiveness as a virtue," unquote. So you're committed. So let me now introduce the panelists for today. Starting at that end, Lisa Beard is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Western Washington University. Their first book is If We Were Kin, Race Identification and Intimate Political Appeals, Oxford 2023. It's focused on the political provocations of James Baldwin, Sylvia Rivera, Lorraine Hansberry, and grassroots LGBTQ+ activists looking at the politics of identity. They win the prize for coming the greatest distance to be with us today, so thank you. Shatema Threadcraft is, I'm saving Melvin's for last. Shatema Threadcraft is Associate Professor of Gender and Sexuality Studies, Philosophy and Political Science at Vanderbilt University, and this year a faculty fellow at the University Center for Human Values at Princeton. She's the author of the multiply prize-winning book, Intimate Justice, The Black Female Body and the Body Politic, and she's now finishing up a new book called The Labors of Resurrection, Black Women, Necromancy, and Morrisonian Democracy, which is on Black femicide and responses to Black death in Ida B. Wells, Mamie Till Bradley, Barbara Smith, Margaret Prescott, and others. Joseph Winters is Alexander F. Hemeyer, Associate Professor of Religious Studies in African and African American Studies, with appointments also in English and Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. His research examines how Black literature and aesthetics develops new reconfigurations of the sacred, piety, Black spirit, and secularity in response to the religious underpinnings of anti-Black violence and coloniality. His first book is Hope Draped in Black, Race, Melancholy, and the Agony of Progress, Duke, 2016, and he's now finishing his second book, Disturbing Profanity, Hip-Hop, Black Aesthetics, and the Volatile Sacred. Finally, Melvin Rogers, who needs no introduction, but he's going to get one. I hate when people say that. Rogers is Professor of Political Science and Associate Director of the PPE Center, the Center for the Study of Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. He works in contemporary democratic theory and the history of American and African American political thought. His first book is The Undiscovered Dewey, Religion, Morality, and the Ethos of Democracy, Columbia, 2008. He's the editor of John Dewey, The Public and Its Problems, Ohio University Press, 2016, and co-editor with Jack Turner of the invaluable African American Political Thought, A Collected History, Chicago, 2021, which has 30 essays on figures in the tradition of African American political thinking. And that book, as well as this one, they're both on sale outside at the table if you're interested. In addition to his published writings, Professor Rogers serves as a co-editor of the Oxford New Histories of Philosophy book series, which focuses on unattended voices in the history of philosophy, as indeed does this book. I see Melvin's project as one of canon formation, archive building, materialization of thinking that has for too long been neglected in the canon and by the canon of political theory. It's a really tremendous project, and it travels over several books and editorial commitments. Rogers' latest book is The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought, published by Princeton in 2023. It is the reason we are here, but we are also here because Melvin Rogers, in addition to being an exemplary political thinker, is also an exemplary colleague, thinker, and friend. And colloquy is how we celebrate that. So welcome, everyone.
Wonderful. Can people hear me okay? Yeah, great. So I want to say thank you to Melvin, to Bonnie, to Juliet, to the Democracy Project, to Ali for having me here today. And my co-panelists, it's a real honor to be invited to reflect upon and celebrate the publication of this beautiful book that teaches us so much. I'm going to focus my comments on some of the things that are staying with me, particularly in Rogers' study of political appeals, his theorization of faith and imagination, and the sensory dimensions of crafting a democratic we, and very briefly how I see some of this coming to bear on contemporary calls for racial justice. So first, the appeals. In The Darkened Light of Faith, Rogers widens the aperture of and refocuses the sight of our attention in the study of democratic politics. In our typical focus in political science on political institutions and legal processes, we so often miss the significance of the world of political appeals, the claims that people make on each other, the claims people advance about who, how, and what we might be politically. Critically, we miss those appeals being issued, to borrow Maria Lugones' phrase, against the oppressive grain, against the grain of political culture, institutions, and legal practices. My own thinking about political appeals is deeply indebted to Melvin's earlier article on Walker's appeal. And so then in this book-length study, even more unfolds. There's very many gifts here, and it's hard to know where to start. For one thing, so that we may listen better to the appeals at the heart of the book, Rogers orients us along the way to the history of language and political culture surrounding the particular appeals he studies in the 19th and early 20th century. So that, for example, when Walker uses the word appeal, we learn how that word precisely was circulating at that time. Or when Du Bois uses the word propaganda, we need to know that he's pulling on a meaning that's not how we would hear it today. When Walker appeals to citizens who counted as citizens and on what grounds was not settled in the particular terms that would come to mean in later decades. So here, or to the meaning of common sense, to the circulating languages of sentimentalism, he orients us not only to the philosophical currents of individual thinkers, but the discursive and political atmospheres in which they were engaging in attempting to change the world. Second, we learn how there can be multiple layers of appeal, multiple audiences and different registers of address in an appeal. Third, one of the things the book sifts through so carefully is that just as appeals can aim to thoroughly transform the context that they're in, their shape is also profoundly constrained by that context. This is about intelligibility, power, and affect. More specifically, to issue appeals in the context of domination and oppression, and to issue those appeals towards those who are enacting domination, what do people have to work with? Rogers considers how the thinkers at the heart of the book use elements of the legitimizing languages of society to change society, how they, quote, gather symbols of their present and America's past, deploy them and speak to them, but always to authorize something that never truly existed, end quote. For example, when Frederick Douglass reimagines the we of We the People, he harnesses an aspirational sense of that we. He reconfigures it. He calls forward a political ethical world that is radically different from the one on offer by the founders. So even as he invokes the founders and the revolutionary spirit, his invocation is a moment of rupture. Rogers tells us that reading in the rupture allows us to do proper justice to the distinctive voice of African Americans and take seriously the trauma that haunts the present. Douglass calls upon a people that may yet be. Rogers writes, he uses the language and the story of the founders to summon something that hasn't existed. Fourth, Rogers shows us how appeals themselves are richly saturated with and constituted by the political analysis of those issuing the appeals. On the one hand, he shows us that in the appeals themselves, there's much to learn about how the thinkers understand the violence of white supremacist ideology as it manifests in political institutions and American political culture. We learn this not only from the thinkers' explicit commentary on this, but also in reading the shape of the appeals themselves. How are they structured? What forms of address? As Rogers shows us, for example, when Walker summons his African-American readers and listeners to consider, evaluate, judge, and analyze, he's doing so against the epistemic violence of white people's racist narratives about Black people's capacity to judge and think. And Walker's issuing these appeals also against the physical violence enacted by white people against Black people who are engaged in forms of education and analysis. So these are examples of how the form or shape of the appeal we can find in how Walker's understanding and intervening in forms of violence. Or Roger writes about how Billie Holiday tutors white people in proper affective responses to Black suffering through her own embodied expression, displaying appropriate emotions, contorted facial expressions of horror and grief in her performance of Strange Fruit. Or the captions the NAACP wrote to accompany a photo of lynching, guiding the white reader in how to read it. In both of these instances, the appeals speak to the way those issuing the appeals understood the particular sickness of white supremacist ways of seeing and the need to transform and profoundly reorient their cognitive and affective responses so that they could regard their fellows with proper regard. At the same time, it is in these appeals that we also encounter the reimaginings of a polity as one structured by care and regard for all people, how those making the appeals reimagine democracy and reconceptualize citizenship. So we find both the account of violence and then the visions. All these appeals are issued into and sent out into a discursive field that's both marked by extreme differences in power. So the question of differentiated costs in making appeals and how those appeals will carry and with what risks is profoundly shaped by domination. We can think just as one example of Wells's office being attacked by a white mob, threats on her life if she would return. And it's this huge site of contest over how the future will be. So it's dangerous and deeply uncertain work, which brings us to faith. As I was starting to read this book, if you'd asked me what I might reflect on in my comments, I would not have said faith, because it's not a word I've spent a lot of time with. It's not in my wheelhouse. But after spending time with these pages, I'm left deeply challenged and moved by Rogers' account of faith. I keep finding myself turning it over and over again in my mind, and it helps name a place I wasn't able to fully see before. Faith for Rogers is, quote, a stance towards a vision of life that one projects into a world that's at variance with that vision, and for which one is willing to struggle in the service of, and do that struggling often against the odds. Rogers draws this account from Douglass, Cooper, Du Bois, Wells, and others who called forth the visions of a transformed polity and democracy from within contexts of racial terror and domination. For none of these thinkers was there any assurance that their visions would arrive. Faith is not optimism, Rogers explains, and it is different from hope, where hope would have a level of confidence in a vision. Faith is, quote, the expression of a loving, even if difficult, commitment, precisely because there is no confidence to be had, at least based on some facts of the matter, in its realization. So I want to slow down with this part of Rogers' definition of faith as a stance towards a vision in contexts that are hostile to that vision. As I understand it now, the stance that is faith is a deep and animating regard for a vision. It's a commitment to the vision. It is care for the vision. Describing Cooper's conceptualization, Rogers writes that faith is a conviction that some end ought to command allegiance, whose content is at variance with the actual workings of society, and for which one is willing to struggle. In a context in which institutions and political culture shaped by white supremacy are profoundly hostile and antagonistic to a vision, where it can be almost crowded out, a stance of faith keeps a sight line. It's a stance that keeps the vision in sight so that one can make moves oriented by that vision. When the atrocities of violence, institutional, extra-legal, epistemic, or when the scale of destruction or the compounding histories of violence is so great and we can't see that the odds are in favor of another kind of world, it strikes me that this practice of finding the stance of faith is a practice that belongs in our most valuable toolkit, along with the practices of imagining up visions of worlds without mass incarceration, without border violence, without police killings, without gendered violence, without settler colonial violence, without genocide, without climate catastrophe. So for everyone here who dreams of more just, more livable, more beautiful ways we could live together on this earth, I do wonder how we might learn from these thinkers about when they struggled and how they found their way back to be in this stance with their visions, even against the odds. You are clear, Melvin, in this book from its outset that you're focusing on the faith, what justified it, from what did they draw their faith? The answer to that is that they draw their faith from the strength of their vision. So this is the focus of the book, not on the places of not faith or losing faith. But I just wonder about the coming back to faith part. And I also wonder, does one's company matter? And if so, how does company matter? In not only crafting the visions, but also keeping our visions in our sight line and keeping our stance of faith. Lest we think that this is outside of the boundaries of political science or feel squeamish about all this talk about faith, Rogers reminds us of the uncertainty of politics at every scale. We don't exercise ultimate control over those to whom we appeal and on whose responses we often depend, he writes. For Douglass and Cooper, Rogers writes, the illusion is not in thinking that one must rely on faith in political life, but in believing that one can get on living in a democratic society without it. That is, the uncertainty is there. Faith is how we navigate living with that uncertainty. Faith is what sustains the work, and it is, Rogers tells us, the imagination's expression. So this brings me to imagination. Imagination, Rogers writes, confronts reality and attempts to fight against the deadening forces of things as they are, the ability to see the not yet. This practice, if we think in our current moment, is in many, many places. It's in the future summoning posters by the People's Paper Co-op, a project that centers women in reentry as leading criminal justice experts and uses art to amplify their stories and visions. Such as the poster that has a description that, quote, in a world where no women are locked up, the sound of music, laughter, parades, and the popping sound of popcorn will fill the streets. This is what Southerners on New Ground, drawing on Chicana feminist and Black feminist political thought, calls third space work. This is Grace Lee Boggs and Jimmy Boggs' Detroit Summer Program, and Grace Lee Boggs explaining in an interview at the turn of the 21st century as she drove through Detroit past vacant lots and empty houses. Detroit is not going to reindustrialize. Something else has got to come out of it. How do we rebuild it now? How do we make something new out of it? These are contemporary abolitionist and world-making practices of dreaming and visioning, reimagining all sorts of institutions, places, and relational practices. This, the imagination, is where political visions for more just worlds emerge from for those issuing the appeals. And the imagination is, as Rogers tells us, what vivifies ideas of the future and makes something that seems remote seem more concrete and alive, that we may be pulled towards it. So imagination is the ground from which the visions emerge. The visions are struggled for through all kinds of political work, including and especially the work of making appeals in the service of those visions. This work is sustained by faith, and then this appeal touches its listeners and aims to awaken their imagination, which then brings life to that vision. I don't have time to spend much time with the relationship in the book between political imagination and the senses, but this is another really powerful thread. But this piece about the soul and the senses is so important in the book. If the imagination attempts to fight off the deadening forces of how things are, Rogers shows us in his readings of the appeals in the book that part of the practice of freedom is reclaiming oneself from the deadening and oppressive forces of white supremacy. And this, in part, means re-enlivening and awakening the senses. This is in Walker. This is in Du Bois. He traces this throughout. I hope we can talk about it more. And it's in the re-education of white people's sensibilities. Lastly, I want to appreciate the particular ways that Rogers is there with the reader as the reader moves through the book. There's a real presence. The accompaniment is also quite concrete, from how he explains his meanings along the way. This is what I mean by perceptual capacities. This is what I mean by rhetoric. To the exceptional signposting, we're going to do this. But before we do that, I need to address this. And it's densely theoretical and historical and philosophical, but also conversational. I think in a way, as you say, Du Bois writes. I actually think these elements are quite significant. To move through complex terrain in this way, I think, speaks to a democratic ethos of the book itself, bringing the reader along, providing us with what we need to think with you. So I want to end here and thank Melvin again for writing this book, and I look forward to the conversation.
Okay, thanks to Allie, Bonnie, Juliet, Melvin, my co-panelists, and thank you to all of you. So I would like to make 3 interventions. So one is going to be a wisecrack. The second is going to be about what Melvin has uncovered regarding Du Bois's foresight. 4 things. The second about Du Bois's foresight. The third, a word on the democratic faith that Wells demonstrated through trolling. And finally, an event from our recent history where I see many of our projects in Black political thought intersecting. So Melvin Rogers' book, The Darkened Light of Faith, Race, Democracy, and Freedom in African American Political Thought, is a towering achievement and a tremendous contribution to Black political thought. I'm in awe of Rogers' method and the care with which he executes it. The book offers a philosophical historical reconstruction of the shared normative visions of both widely read and cited members of what we think of as a canon of Black political thought, lesser-known thinkers, and then quite well-known artists who have not received treatment within the discipline. So Rogers presents two questions. First, how should we understand the political, philosophical thinking of African Americans who so often found themselves dominated by the American society they so diligently sought to transform? And second, what must their vision of democracy presuppose about the people to whom they appealed and the society in which they stood? So Rogers presents what he says is these thinkers' ethical account of political life, and says that an ethical account of democracy, for example, refers to those features of action, self-understanding, and the value attached to others that are themselves guided by norms of freedom and equal regard. To think of democracy in ethical terms, he says, is to understand freedom and equal regard as forming key features of a cultural horizon to which we can become habituated. Within this framework, questions of who we are and who we should be figure centrally as these thinkers confront and seek to upend the workings and habits of white supremacy. In the book, Rogers presents the normative vision of democracy that sustained them and that they helped to shape and articulate. So for them, democratic politics is not merely an arrangement of procedural functions, but a means for rearranging and transforming our sensibilities, attuning the perceptual capacities to the claims Black Americans made and the pain they endure, bringing them into the cognitive affective field. Now, Rogers says the emphasis of this book on character or soul is fundamentally about centering a question. Who do we take ourselves to be in the lives we live and the practices in which we participate? Now, through it all, Rogers emphasizes one thing on which we can all agree, that these thinkers kept the faith, where he sees faith as a stance toward a vision of life that one projects into the world at variance with that vision, and for which one is willing to struggle in the service of and often against all odds. Now, first, quickly, I want to say that I think it's nice to be in what we now have to call the Department of Assigning White People Homework in our multiracial democracy. So if Juliet feels that white people's civic habits are, shall we charitably say, subpar, and less charitably remedial, Melvin unearths their curriculum for improvement. But the rest of us should not worry, because I think Diva has tons of work for the rest of us to do all the time, so we're all good. Nobody is left out. I think it's fairly obvious that there will be no rest if we want to have and keep our democracy. Second, I think Melvin demonstrates Du Bois's characteristic prescience as he shows that Du Bois anticipated work by scholars who emphasize the importance of narratives in social movements. So here I also want to say how much I enjoyed the Du Bois chapters. I was persuaded by the argument regarding rhetoric and for the emphasis on its democratic character. I was persuaded by Rogers' arguments regarding the aesthetics of soulcraft. Rogers does not belabor this, but it does present an important corrective to Gooding-Williams. And I was also reminded about how persuaded I am about the romantic account of personhood and the soul that reaches forth into the world. So Rogers says if the idea of the people opens up space for evocative appeals to reimagine and reconstitute society, Du Bois's intervention sought to give such reconstitution direction. So his goal was to answer a question, how do you move the people? And here we mean white Americans enjoying the rights and privileges of American democracy such that they will embrace a reconstituted vision of themselves. Soule's response to this question in the domain of rhetoric. Rhetoric functions to move the audience, and Du Bois theorizes the purpose of rhetoric and its aesthetic power specifically. Now, when Du Bois describes art as a vehicle for persuasion, Rogers says that he's giving a signal about his method. Quote, he treats art as a broad category that is engaged in persuasion. It includes his literary engagements with the public. In it, Du Bois seeks to expand the horizon of the recipient, to cultivate a sympathetic imagination, to generate identification and concern. The point of rhetoric is to take the reader to the experiential source from which appropriate emotions and judgments spring. Rogers quotes Hill, that is, we are made to feel by being taken to the source of feeling. Hill ties narration and movement together because a good rhetorician is assessed by how well they can move in heart and mind the audience. Now, I think that Du Bois and Rogers are onto something important here. It is also significant that Du Bois chose narrative, storytelling about Burgart, Josie, and Crummell as his persuasive form. So scholars who focus on the importance of narrative in social movements, Paletta and Chen, for example, argue that narratives are effective among available discursive forms because research suggests that we immerse ourselves in stories, striving to experience vicariously the events and emotions that the protagonists experience, and suspending our natural proclivity to counter-argue. They point out the clear benefit of how narratives spellbind and enthrall us. They say to tell an absorbing story, research suggests, and you can win people to your cause. So narratives have orientation, complicating actions, and evaluation of events, characters, protagonists, antagonists, allies, and witnesses. The denouement of the story is both explanation and evaluation, and narratives project a normative future. That is the moral of the story. Now, given the tremendous aesthetic resources of the Black community, it makes sense to put them in the service of social movement. So I was really taken by this. But on to Wells. Now, I want to raise the point that people like horror. And Jacqueline Goldsby, I believe, suggests that lynching may have been part of the origin of the visual genre in American culture. And Wells did not leave the matter of lynching in the domain of horror. So Catherine Squires says that non-dominant publics, such as Black public spheres, can take three forms: enclaved, counterpublic, and satellite. Enclave publics are hidden from the view of the dominant public, whereas counterpublics expressly challenge them to argue against dominant conceptions of the group. Wells' methods were complex, but with regard to these two formulations or configurations of publics, her strategy, I think, was a project of political education in enclave Black publics and trolling in counterpublic ones. Her second strategy is worthy of consideration in our age of misinformation. That is, Wells told the truth freely, and perhaps more and better than anyone else before or since, but, and this is most significant, she also understood that the truth, that sincerity, was not always the best response to a lie. So the editor of the Memphis Commercial Appeal, Edward Carmack, was an intemperate lunatic, and Wells trolled the hell out of him and played him like a fiddle. So in her first published pamphlet on lynching, Southern Horrors, she would demonstrate that the charge of rape was only mobilized to justify 1/3 of lynching. This fact enraged Carmack, who professed a disdain for lynching, primarily for how it tarnished the South's reputation, but he supported the practice in the cases of interracial rape. Lisa White writes, by logically refuting the rape myth, Ida Wells forced Carmack into a corner from which he characteristically came out fighting, meaning that he walked right into and then remained ensnared in her trap. Wells then parodied his foghorn leghorn bluster regarding Southern mores and chivalry, making liberal use of irony, turning his victims into her criminals, and then made sure that he saw what she had done by sending him what she had written to provoke him into a frenzy. So she added him, right? Wells would write, Memphis knew of the awful crime, knew then and knows today who the men were who committed it, and yet not the first step was ever taken to apprehend the guilty wretches who walk the streets today with the brand of murderer upon their foreheads, but safe from harm as the most upright citizens of the community. Here, White says, Wells reversed criminal guilt while mimicking the white press's rhetoric about her own crime. So the lynch mob was guilty. They, and not the Black men they murdered, had brands on their forehead. Wells, in fact, expressly goaded Carmack into the fight she wanted, got her cause into his papers, and kept him in a frenzied cycle of rage that caused him to go on a misogynistic rant that was beyond the pale even for the time. So White says, Wells acted on the adage that any publicity is good publicity. She regularly sent him copies of articles she wrote in exile, who Carmack would then respond belligerently. Then he would forward copies of his wrath to Wells and other editors in response to her constant barrage of embarrassing publicity from Memphis in the South, especially when she went to Great Britain. Carmack published a series of tirades trying to discredit her. Members of the British press were utterly scandalized by his words, his coarse tone, as it was altogether unpublishable. White says in May 26, 1894, in an issue of the Memphis Commercial, Carmack called Wells a series of derogatory names, including notorious Negro courtesan, disreputable colored woman, half-cultured hater of all things Southern, saddle-colored Sapphira, intriguing adventuress, strumpet, malicious wanton paramour to both J.L. Fleming and Taylor Nightingale, unimportant adventuress, and infamous slanderer and traducer. So I want all of that on my tombstone, and I dream of making a man call me that, right, and making him that mad. But he sent this to her, and she in turn sent it out to other editors who would then condemn these outrageous attacks. White writes, undoubtedly Wells, as an African American and equally contemptuously as a woman, did not register on his scale of worthy opponents. However, her endless prodding and repetitious attacks, which mimicked his own rhetorical tactics, left him no choice other than to defend his honor as he would that of any other Southern white man. In the process, he unintentionally granted her access to the venues for protest that she so desperately needed, that is the white press, and to his dismay, fostered more embarrassment than respect for Southern culture. And she, the saddle-colored Saphira, the intriguing adventuress, the infamous slanderer and traducer, never directly attacked him, and could thus remain the cool observer to his utterly unhinged name-calling, while enticing others to look on in horror, as she herself never having really entered the fray. Now, all of this reminds me of something that my students said about storytelling around sexual assault. So a 19-year-old once asked me an arresting question years ago: who is it that needs to hear that rape is wrong? And I think about this a lot, and I also think of the multifaceted ways that Wells responded to people who absolutely already knew better. Now, I want to close with something to reiterate that I do see a role for sincerity, for aesthetics, and faith in politics. And I'm going to show a clip because, one, I was moved by it, and I think people need to see it. But also, I think it's a scene that I think brings together Melvin's vision of democratic aesthetics and faith in reflective agency in the performance. That is, the agent is absolutely aware of what's happening and improvises an incredible teaching moment. But it's also a stark juxtaposition that is itself a demonstration of the true source of power in democracies that I think Diva and I can endorse, maybe Bonnie too. So it's a faith that is both not of this world, but that can also be read as a faith in our worldliness. And I think that Juliet might endorse, given that it references sources of joy outside of the work of democratic repair, though it is also exemplary, so that's why I think her endorsement might be qualified. So now I'd like to show the clip.
The world didn't give to me this joy that I have. The world didn't give it to me. The world didn't give it. The world can't take it away. This strength that I have. The world didn't give it to me. This strength that I have. The world didn't give it to me. This strength that I have. The world didn't give it to me. The world didn't give it. The world can't take it away.
Thank you.
Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
First, I would like to thank the directors of the Democracy Project, Bonnie Honig, Juliet Hooker, and Melvin Rogers, right, for the invitation. I would like to thank Ali for all of your hard work in organizing this and being patient, my response to emails, and so forth, right. I'd like to thank my co-panelists, Lisa Beard, as well as Shatema Threadcraft, who I've known for 30 years almost now, right, at different times, right. And lastly, and certainly not least, I want to show my gratitude to Dr. Melvin Rogers for his brilliance, generosity, and care, as evidenced in this masterful book, The Darkened Light of Faith. I've known Melvin for 20 years now, so yeah. So what I want to do here, and I think it kind of riffs off of what my colleagues have said already, is kind of think about the broader structure of the text, right? What I think the interventions are, right, particularly in response to republicanism, right, in thinking about broadly kind of black political thought. And what I see is some of the kind of, I think, key moves, right, some of the key moves in the text. And then at the end, I want to kind of go back to the first 10 pages, because I take it that this project in many ways is situating itself in what Rogers sees as a certain kind of pessimistic trend in black studies, right? Whether it's Tennessee Coates, and we can argue about whether he's a pessimist or not, but right, or whether it's Frank Wilderson, Patrice Douglass, and others. And I actually want to suggest that there's some really potentially maybe unanticipated overlap, I think, right, between you and some of these Afro-pessimism, but also show where there are differences, and maybe think about maybe in the gap is where something like faith lies, right? But we can talk about that. So this always happens to me. Okay, all right. So one important intervention that I see in Darkened Light of Faith has something to do with, right, a certain kind of, right, relationship to democratic republicanism, right? So I feel like, I'm not a political theorist, but I feel like, taking political theory, because I feel like whenever I hear democratic republicanism, two names always seem to come up, like Skinner, Pettit, right? And in particular, a certain kind of understanding of freedom, not as non-intervention, right, which is usually associated with liberalism, but as non-domination, right? And as I take it, right, often in those traditions, right, non-domination or arbitrary power, there's a certain kind of, let's say, template, right, of that, right, which is slavery, right, but often drawn from, right, maybe, I don't know, Roman law or something like that, right? And so what I take Rogers to be saying very importantly at the beginning is, right, I want to make a distinction between political slavery and chattel slavery, right? Yep. Such that, right, if political slavery has something to do, right, with freedom being taken away, right, by a political arrangement, right, chattel slavery has something to do with that slavery being attached to your subjectivity, right? And I'll come back to this because I think this actually is a moment of overlap between Rogers and someone like Frank Wilderson, right? Also, right, similar to a host of authors, some sitting here right here, right, I see Rogers asking us a question, right? What happens to familiar concepts and practices when we think some of those concepts and practices, right, with a different canon, right, of African-American, right, thinkers, authors, activists, and artists, from David Walker to Ida B. Wells to Billie Holiday? How does centering, right, racial domination and racial disregard shift our understanding, right, well, I should say unsettle, right, disrupt, shift, and maybe even transform our understanding of freedom, democracy, peoplehood, faith, aesthetics, America, and so forth, right? So it's not simply here a project of inclusion, right, but a certain notion of the possibility of transforming our understanding of some of these, right, familiar concepts, but also defamiliarizing our understanding, right? So I take it, right, if right, he's setting up this project in some way, right, to both push, right, and disrupt a certain understanding of freedom as non-domination by taking seriously chattel slavery, not just political slavery, right? Part of how he develops, right, you know, his project is a distinction, as others have pointed out, or a contrast between a static notion of the people, right, and a more aspirational notion of the people, right? Or sometimes it's, right, the language is an existent notion of the people, right, and an aspirational notion of the people, right? This distinction, right, Rogers points out, I think, brilliantly in Walker's Appeal, right, where the appeal, right, solicits the reader, right, to critically respond, right, to the wretched conditions of antebellum black suffering, while expanding, right, our general sense of who is eligible for citizenship and freedom, right? Or Ida B. Wells, right, using American exceptionalism, right, or America's standards of being, right, more civilized and advanced than everyone else, right, against itself in a certain way, right? So in this, the logic here is that an appeal to, Wells's appeal to America's collective claims about itself becomes a way to generate a sense of shame, right, disgust, right, at the treatment of black Americans, right, and also to take seriously this gap between the ideal and, right, and the actual, right? I think it's something like Berkovich's understanding of the Jeremiah, but we can talk about that, right? The imagination, it seems to me, is crucial here for Rogers' project, right? Imagination, right, as a faculty that allows us to imagine, right, imagine a future, right, to imagine and to imagine and seek a future, right, even if, right, the possibilities that we want to be actualized, right, seem to go up against probability, right, or seem to go up against what is possible, right, in the present, right? Right, so there's some kind of gap here between the now, right, and the not yet, right, what Ernst Bloch would call the not yet, right, or what Derrida might call the to come. I don't think that's not necessarily Melvin's people's, but something like the not yet or the avenir, that which is to come, right, right. So in addition to this distinction between the aspirational and the existent, right, I think what's crucial here, as my colleagues have pointed out, is the importance of thinking about character, sentiment, and sympathy, right. Right, there's a kind of faith here in the force of persuasion, right, right, that not necessarily, right, the force of reason, right, we begin someone like Robert Brandom, right, but maybe the force of rhetoric, right, and the possibility of transforming, right, how people relate to the world, how people feel, how people are affected by the world through rhetoric, right, or, right, through images or through song in the case of, right, Billie Holiday, right. The affect or sentiment, right, becomes an opportunity or a site to change and transform people's behaviors, their habits, and ultimately their character, right? This means that Rogers' emphasis is more on social and cultural interactions, right, or what some would call the informal political sphere, than maybe something like the more formal legal, juridical kind of understanding of politics, right? Or at the end of the day, what Dewey might call publics, right? And so I take it, right, that there's something about, maybe in conversation with someone like Robert Brandom, for Rogers, freedom is a social phenomenon, right? It involves interaction, communication, debate, contestation, holding each other accountable, being clear about normative commitments and patterns of judgment, which your sources of authority are, et cetera, right? But at the same time, as Rogers points out, and certainly many of the authors, right, and this is something that my religious studies, training would get me to think about, right? Sociality doesn't just happen through positive attachments, right? Sociality happens through violent exclusions, right? So there's a moment where Rogers talks about this idea of tying and binding, right? So one of the things, I'm sure it's the same, similar in political theory, one of the things that connects us as religious studies scholars is, well, we don't know what religion is, right? But no, seriously, when you teach a theory and methods class, it's like, okay, there's no real definition. And that's actually what is the occasion for thinking in complicated ways about religion. But one etymology of religion is the Latin term religare, which means to tie and to bind, right? So one of the things that comes up, I think, when we're thinking about lynching, right, we're just thinking just generally about a kind of, right, how sociality, right, is often constituted, right, through a certain kind of violent exclusion. You get this in Mary Douglas's work, George Bataille's work, Girard, Durkheim, and others, right? And according to Rogers, we have much to learn from black people, right, who have witnessed how sociality works through this exclusion or a certain kind of misrecognition. Okay, right, so I may have others, but I think I have other things to say about, I think, the project, but I think others have said it probably better than I can. What I want to think about is, right, where does pessimism intersect with this project, right, particularly Afro-pessimism, right? How does Rogers' project situate itself in conversation, right, but also in ways that part ways with an author like Frank Wilderson, right, or Patrice Douglas? I'll say a little bit about Afro. I don't want to assume that everybody's familiar with Afro-pessimism. I'll say a little bit here. We can have more conversation about it, right? But I think what is interesting, right, as I go back to what I said earlier, what's interesting is this moment where Rogers is talking about the distinction between chattel slavery and political slavery. And there's a moment, I think it's around, because I just remember the index, I think it's like around 98 or something like that, right, where you're talking about, right, Thomas Jefferson, right, and the kind of American revolutionaries, right? And there's a sense in which they were seeking something like a restoration, right? A restoration of rights, a restoration of a sense of dignity that had been taken away, right, by the monarch. Right, and you say that's different, right, for the enslaved African, right, insofar as that sense, right, that sense of dignity and worth were actually, or the protection of that dignity and worth, right, were actually never afforded, right, the black, right, by the social world that they were in, right. Now you ask, how is this connected to Afro-pessimism, right? For someone like Frank Wilderson, at least in his book Afro-pessimism, one of the things that he points out is, right, is that there's a certain narrative of redemption, he suggests, right, and here you have to be careful with Wilderson's a structuralist. So he's just going to say, look, I know there's all these differences, but I'm going to look at the structural continuities, right? And I think this is important because Rogers points out at the beginning the importance of Hayden White's work and the notion of meta-history, right? And the kind of stories that shape our understanding of the world. So for Wilderson, he's saying there's a certain structure of redemption that often shapes our understanding of suffering, right? So you have an original plenitude, then some kind of loss, and then a recovery, right? What Wilderson is saying is that for the black, which is a complicated structural position, that original plenitude was never, right, was never available, right? And I'm not suggesting that Rogers is totally agreeing here, but there is a moment of overlap here, right? To suggest that the logic of redemption, right, is a logic that not only maybe not helpful to frame black strivings, right, against anti-black racism, right? Right, but there actually might be something about, right, the narrative of redemption that itself reproduces, right, a certain kind of violence, right? And what's interesting in the last chapter, right, of the Darkened Light of Faith, when you go to James Baldwin, right, you're suggesting that James Baldwin also refuses a logic of redemption, right? But, right, instead of the language of redemption, right, Rogers wants to introduce the language of atonement, right? So I think it's important. I think it's important here, right? Again, I'm being cliche. I'm the religious studies guy, right? But it's important, the language of faith, redemption, refusal of redemption, but also this language of atonement, which for Rogers allows us to refuse and reject the notion that we could ever recover, right, or make whole a history of tragedy, trauma, catastrophe, and so forth, but still think about not reparations, the reparative, correction, improvement and so forth. But atonement suggests an ongoing process, right, of reckoning, right, that's a term that's used a lot these days, but reckoning with the past, right, but also the possibility of opening up a different kind of future. Right? So that distinction, I think, that's not a distinction that I think for someone like Wilderson, atonement would still be within a certain kind of structure of redemption, but you allow for us to think about a pragmatic distinction, it seems to me, and political distinction between the two, right? Secondly, just a couple more things, I'll be quiet, right? But secondly, right, is the emphasis that Rogers, right, puts on sentiment, aesthetics, and feeling actually overlaps, I think, with a certain kind of Afro-pessimist emphasis on libidinal economy, right? So libidinal economy, some people is like, what is this term, right? Libido, economy, and so forth, right? For Wilderson, right, in addition to, not in replace of, but in addition to political economy, right? If you want to understand how anti-blackness operates, you have to understand something about fantasy, affect, right, attraction and repulsion, right, or as Dr. Threadcraft was pointing out, the ways in which horror sometimes can be something that people are attracted to, right, particularly when it's right. So there's a kind of way in which like affect, desire gets structured and organized, right, through media, through film, through music, and so forth, right. So one interesting conversation we might have is, I mean, Rogers does such a brilliant job in thinking about and showing how, right, the Walkers, the Ida B. Wells, the Baldwins, right, Billie Holidays, right, use affect in a certain type of, use aesthetics, right, to open up the possibility of transformation, right. But we might not think about like, how that happens, right. I think Dr. Beer points this out, how that always happens within a certain kind of structure of affect, right, or a certain kind of economy, right, which shapes, doesn't determine, but certainly shapes how people respond to black suffering, right? How people respond to, right, images of black suffering, as we saw here, right? Or the kind of ways in which people get both attracted and repelled to black bodies and so forth. So I just want to think about the ways in which the kind of aesthetic transformation is always happening within a certain kind of, right, structure, right? A moving structure of affect, feeling, and so forth. And then finally, I would love to think a lot about, right, a certain idea of America that runs through, right, your work. So America, it seems to me, is more than, like, if we're thinking about here, is more than just like a territory, right? There's a certain idea here. It's a symbol in some way, right? And you suggest at the beginning of an introduction that there's a lot of, that, many people are moving to think in terms of the transnational, the international, and the global, but you want to suggest, not that you're not thinking those things as well, but you want to suggest, I actually want to think with, right, a certain idea of America, right, that all these authors and artists that you're working with, we're both thinking within and outside of, right? But it seems to me that's the horizon you're working within, right? A certain idea of America, right? Racial domination within, right? America's history, America's racial past, but also thinking about a different kind of future for blacks and whites, right? Primarily. For someone like Wilderson, right? The structure of antagonisms, right, within America includes black, white, as well as indigenous, right? Why is this important, right? It seems to me that it opens up potentially, right, a different framework for thinking about, right, racial antagonism, right? Such that, right, Western imperialism, right, the human, right, humanism, right, even if America is being privileged in a certain type of way, right, it might open us up to think about the ways in which raciality, right, racial antagonisms, right, in some way are shaped by a particular understanding of the human capacity, right, human rationality, and so forth. I hope I'm making sense here, right? And why I think that's important here is because many of the authors, as you suggest, many of the authors and activists and thinkers that you're working with, right, themselves, even as they're pushing back against anti-black racism in the Americas, right, often themselves adopt a certain understanding of Western civilization, right? As you mentioned Frederick Douglass, we can think about Douglass's, as an ambassador to Haiti, right? We can think here about even Anna Julia Cooper at the beginning. I mean, it's rhetorical, but at the beginning of Voice from the South, the way that she's like, well, one of the reasons why, right, women and black women should be treated as equal, so we're not, because America is not like those barbaric people in the East or something like that, right? And this is not me saying, oh, I'm more enlightened than Andrew. That's not, my point is, we inherit those contradictions, right? And I wonder if, right, when thinking about, right, let's say racial antagonisms within a certain horizon of America potentially loses the ways in which, right, something like an idea of Western civilization, something like an idea of the human, that certainly goes through an idea of America, but maybe is more extensive, and maybe we want to think about that if we're thinking about, right, global, broader notions of justice. And then finally, and I'll be quiet, one of the things that Frank Wilderson says in his work, he says, look, I write poetry, I write plays, aesthetics is important. But he says to the liberation struggle, I'll bring my aesthetic, but I'll also bring weapons. Right? This is not me saying I don't want to bring, right? That's not what but it does open up a question, right, about the relationship between the force of persuasion and physical force. And so that it might be that the distinction maybe between, right, some of the authors that you're thinking about, or maybe yourself, and someone like Wilderson is not so much that the pessimist can't think, right, a different kind of future, a radically different kind of future. It's how that future, right, how we talk about that future and how we might get there, that might be the difference, right? I say all that, right, to just say, I mean, I really enjoyed reading this book. I hope what I said makes sense, and I look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
All right, so I'm overwhelmed. It's a lot. Now, I want to thank Bonnie and Juliet and Ali for hosting and arranging this. And obviously, I want to thank our guests, co-panelists. So I appreciate the comments a great deal. And of course, I want to thank all of you for coming and listening to us talk about this text. So let me just try to say a word about how I see this book that I wrote. I see it in the first instance as a contribution to the history of political thought. That it seemed to me, and it continues to seem to me, that there's a great many conversations about freedom and equality, domination and injustice in the context of the United States, if we focus there for a moment, by political theorists. And there are resources at hand to reflect on these topics, and yet they do not appear, these figures, as candidates from which we can draw to understand how to respond to these problems, how to imagine freedom and equality and what's demanded of us in order to realize it. And so that got me sort of thinking, how ought we to understand the ways in which African Americans have constantly appealed to the nation and done so, and did so under extreme conditions of exclusion and inequality and the like. Or to put it differently, how must they have understood democracy so as to justify their own appeals, even if only to themselves? And my aim was then to sort of travel from 1829 with David Walker's classic appeal to the colored citizens of the world, but in particular and very expressly to those of the United States, to the 1950s and 60s with James Baldwin, with a whole series of figures, major and minor figures, if you will, from the perspective of the book, not necessarily with respect to the history, but major and minor figures in between. And when you focus on this question, what begins to emerge from these figures is a vision of democracy. And what begins to emerge are the constituent elements that they take to be central to a democratic society, and constituent elements that they take to be essential to a democratic society that falls short of the ideals that it otherwise claims to be committed to. And the first thing we see is this idea of people talk in African American thinkers, right? And what I try to argue in the book is that when you focus on this term through these figures, one of the things that you see is that they mean the people in two senses. It's a descriptive account, those who enjoy rights and privileges of the Constitution, but it's also aspirational, a people not yet. And that raises then a problem. Well, how do you get the people, in fact, to embrace a new configuration of themselves that can become the foundation for a new configuration of society and give life to new institutional forms? And to understand that, what we come to see is the importance of rhetoric. Rhetoric understood not merely as a practice of persuasion, moving your fellows from one side literally to another, but a practice that tries to honor the judgment or the judging capacities of your fellows. And the reason why honoring the judging capacities of your fellows is important is because you want, in the absence of appropriate laws, you want your fellows still to act in the light of these new values that they say they've been persuaded of. Right? And so this second dimension is a way of honoring the reflective and epistemic capacities of your fellows. But one of the things these figures realize is that words by themselves will not be sufficient. So how do you enliven them? How do you vivify, right? And thus aesthetics becomes quite important. Images of a just society that draw people in, and images of an unjust and illiberal society that they hope you will recoil from, preparing the way to be drawn towards something better. Right? That's the sort of centrality of the great journalist and theorist in her own right, Ida B. Wells, as she reflects on lynching in the 1890s and onward. But they also thought to themselves that it's not merely that you want your fellows to hold a particular vision of a just society. You want them to feel that if that vision of a just society is betrayed, something about themselves has been betrayed. And thus these figures find it important to centralize affect or the emotions as a means to sort of move the interior life of one's fellows. But they know all of this is uncertain. They don't exercise, by virtue of their own democratic commitments, they don't exercise sovereign authority over those to whom they appeal and on whom they otherwise rely. And for this reason, they find themselves reaching for faith as the ground of their actions. Because they know that they're dealing with their fellows who might respond to them and respond to their appeals with no. This can't happen here, or we won't affirm it here. And so this was, in broad strokes, the picture of their understanding of democracy that I tried to paint over the course of these pages, realizing that the story is not exhaustive. There are other figures that we can appeal to. And also realizing that I made a decision as I was moving through the archive to appeal to those figures or those moments in a figure's intellectual career, those moments in which they were committed to the American polity and trying to make it better. So I don't spend a great deal of time with the later part of W.E.B. Du Bois, who becomes quite pessimistic in his own right about the prospect of realizing democracy in the West. He thought you could realize it elsewhere, but not in the West. Right? I don't spend a great deal of time with the arc of the tradition of African American political thought that does not see in the American polity a possibility for transformation. That story is worth telling, and it's worth pursuing. It's not the story I tell, and that of course gives a particular shape then to the project. So that when Ida B. Wells, if I reach for Shatema's reflection for a moment, so when Ida B. Wells appeals to horror and deploys it in her writings, the people that she most have in mind or that she imagines are those that might potentially recoil from it. Right? When Douglass, in his 4th of July address, is appealing to the nation and their failure to honor the revolutionary impulse of the founders, Douglass doesn't have in mind the staunch racist. He doesn't have in mind the slave master. He has in mind a sort of vision of the American citizen that is not yet settled about its commitments. Or when Du Bois in The Souls of Black Folk is speaking both to Black Americans and to their white counterparts about the sort of distortive effect of white supremacy, he thinks that they can be moved. These are their arguments. And that's because running through all of this, what they share, aside from those constituent features that I just named, they share a vision of human beings as not settled, as open to the possibility of being transformed and improved. This is why throughout the book I reach for the term perfectionism, not to talk about it in state, but to capture the ways in which these figures are presupposing something about our nature as the basis for their appeal, without which it would not make any sense. So that by the time we get to 1972 with No Name in the Street with James Baldwin says, it's a book I don't do anything with in the text, because he says that after Martin Luther King was assassinated, something in him went away. And the something in him that went away, he says, was the reason why he wrote. Because King for him represented a crystallization of an America not yet. And now King was assassinated. And thus the embodied vision of an America not yet was assassinated. I don't do anything with that part, because I don't know what one would do with that. And I think that brings me then to the Afro-pessimist. The final chapter of the book, the chapter on James Baldwin, is an attempt to manage the aspirational politics that has been developing across the book. And it's concerned to develop or to manage it in a particular kind of way, because aspirational politics can easily articulate with the ways in which the United States talks about itself as exceptional and the like. And so I needed a way to talk about this tradition that doesn't lapse into that. And James Baldwin becomes the means to do this, in which Baldwin wants to describe a form of politics and political action that emerges from our racialized history and is stained as a result. And because it is stained, even when you get affirmative gestures, whether they be legal, institutional, or economic, we can't make sense of those affirmative gestures independent of the stain that they are responding to. And Baldwin wants to claim that it is that fact that gets in the way and prohibits, in some ways, a kind of redemption story, or a story that we will one day redeem ourselves from slavery and the problems of injustice. So the chapter on Baldwin is an attempt to show the way in which the tradition is very much sensitive to the persistence of white supremacy and the antagonism it encodes that Afro-pessimists are attentive to, but without saying that that fully captures our history, because the tradition of African-American political thought is a tradition of resistance, forged alongside the tradition of white supremacy. And so my goal was to try to sort of capture some of what the Afro-pessimists seem to have in mind, but without going all the way. And in one sense, it may just simply be a function of the vocation. I hope it's not, but in one sense, it may be a function of the vocation. I don't know what it would mean to finally embrace the Afro-pessimist as a political theorist, as a political scientist. The vocation itself suggests to us, those of us who are political scientists, that politics matters, and that human agency can affect a transformation, however distant it might be, right? And my sense is that that orientation, not because they're political scientists, but that orientation runs through these figures, right? And the thought is that if we sort of take seriously this kind of history, it would most certainly encourage our faith, even if darken it, right? And there are resources there, I think, for us to deploy for just these reasons. So I'll stop there and thank my panelists once again. Thank you.
So the floor is open for questions.
So I don't know if do we need a microphone?
Yes.
Okay. So if you want to just raise your hand if you have a question. All right, Bonnie.
Cheers.
privilege. Can I be heard? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So I just wanted, thank you so much, all of you. This was really already fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. I just wanted to start by pointing out a few ways in which the conversation has been in opposition to certain kinds of liberal and procedural understandings of the kinds of politics we're talking about. Pointing out that it's important maybe to even a self-reliant version of perfectionism, who the company is that you keep. Talking about the rhetorical strategies of trolling and adding and drumming up a public and public interaction. Talking about the idea of an affective economy. All of those things exert a kind of gravitational pull on a politics, and show us the extent to which, and it's going to come out as a statement, I'm just tired, I apologize for that, but it is a question for you, Melvin. Show us how different it is to think about appeals like Walker's and others in the tradition, not in terms of, well, one way to think about them is a Murdahl-like way in which you're caught in a contradiction and you got to straighten out you say you have these commitments, but then you live apart from them. That's sort of an old American exceptionalist idea, as you point out in the book. And what you're also arguing, it seems to me, therefore, is what's really important is a vision of a possible future that breaks you out of the trap of you're either honestly committed to your principles or you're not, and if you're not, you got to straighten yourself out. Which doesn't appeal to any of these things that all the panelists have been talking about and that you yourself talk about when you're talking about aesthetics and rhetoric. So in addition to everything else the book is doing, I'm trying to say, is it's reminding us of the difference between democratic vision and liberal procedural commitments to consistency. Consistency does not, I'm saying it as a statement again, but I would love to hear your response. Consistency does not, in a perfectionist way, produce progress. It reduces progress, I want to say. So I wonder what you think about that, because I don't think this was necessarily one of the things you were interested in sort of identifying as the goal of the argument, and yet at the same time I see it as a very powerful contribution to an argument about the limits of liberal justice.
So Bonnie's question is about a certain way of understanding the failure to honor liberalism that turns on a gap between our practices and our principles. And thus the response then would be, how do we generate the right kind of procedures and institutions that can straighten us out, or how can we, as was thought in the 50s and 60s as part of a kind of liberal re-education in response to segregation, how can we adopt in our own minds a certain kind of consistency of purpose so that our principles and our actions align? And that what this, as I'm listening to Bonnie, that what this obscures is the kind of transformation that needs to happen in the kind of moral and political life of the culture, precisely because the language of freedom and the language of equality doesn't point on the backside, right, to the kinds of the sort of the expansive environment and the expansiveness of the citizenry that we otherwise would want. And so if, in fact, you're thinking about expanding your citizenry, you're not just simply using the same language of freedom and equality, it really means something else. And thus there's a rupture between, let's say, what the founders had to say about freedom and equality and what Douglass is saying. Although Douglass knows that we have a love affair with the founders, so he's going to use the founder talk to help bridge this divide, to get you from here to over here. The thing I would say, though, about this is that I think that that's a particular version of the liberal story. You know, liberalism gets such of a, it's under assault, right? And that pejorative neoliberalism, that's a particular instantiation of liberalism. It seems to me that James Baldwin is a liberal. Baldwin is committed to a certain vision of freedom against both interference and against domination. Baldwin is committed to a vision of equality that grows out of a certain thick religious tradition. We wouldn't call it the natural law tradition, but it's not too far from it that some liberals adopt. What Baldwin recoils from in the traditional liberal story is a certain description of human nature as such. So in that first liberal story, the founders essentially got it right. In Baldwin's story, they did not at all. We're flawed creatures. And so what Baldwin finds himself saying to what he would often call the white liberals is that the problem with your liberalism is that it emanates from a sort of misdescribed understanding of human nature that is captured and expressed through a certain vision of America's uprightness. Baldwin wasn't alone. I mean, I don't talk about this figure, right? But he would stand very nicely alongside Reinhold Niebuhr, the theologian who's making a similar kind of argument, right? I don't talk a great deal about King in this. I think King is sensitive to this kind of argument, right? I mean, Douglass says, the polity was, false to the declarations of the past, false to them in the present, and solemnly bind themselves to be false to the future declarations. So then, Douglass, why are you still making use of the Declaration? So he too understands the ways in which our nature is deformed, will fall off, and the like. So I tend to read Baldwin as offering what I would call a kind of chastened liberalism. That looks very different from the procedural version.
Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you, Professor. I have a question about how you think of faith, because I think of faith very differently than you, right? So I think of faith as kind of the acceptance of something and the absence of critical thinking and creativity, whereas you seem to think of faith as the manifestation of critical thinking, the manifestation of creativity, a world at odds with the world that exists. So, I mean, the place where we encounter most often faith, and faith is most often performed, is religion, right? And when you are a religious person, you accept a slate of beliefs wholeheartedly, and there is an amount of creativity in how you accept those beliefs, how you perform those beliefs, but at the end of the day, if you're a Christian, you believe there is a God, that God is good, and maybe you should love thy neighbor, right? And you can take that idea of faith and apply it to the political context. Like, I, for example, have faith in the democratic system, right? If I thought truly critically and truly creatively, I could probably imagine an American government that operates a little bit better than the one we have now, and a system government that's a little bit better, but I don't. I have faith in our democracy, and I will act on that faith. So in that way, I think that faith is a rejection of freedom, and if anything, faith is kind of a submission, right? I submit my ability to think critically and creatively to faith. So, I think on the other hand, you think of faith as kind of a form of freedom. So do you think that your definition of faith has room for my definition of faith? If not, are they at odds with each other?
Well, I appreciate that question. It's a very bold question. It's a very rich question, isn't it? I think there's a great many Christians that would go, I don't recognize that description of faith. Right? Because there's a description of Christian faith that sits alongside and depends on epistemic humility. And so yes, one might believe in a God, but one is very cautious to say that one has rightly interpreted what the order and edict is from that God. And it is in that moment among Christians that it opens up a discursive space for conversation, for contestation, in which we get a whole series of reimaginative interpretations, for example, of what the Bible means or what the Quran might mean, right? So I think, so if I was sort of speaking on behalf of the Christian for a moment, sort of kind of Christian, I think that's one response they might offer up. In terms of the work of these figures, I think you're right that the description of faith that is at work here is one about creativity. It is one about openness. It is one that permits Baldwin to say that, look, any God worth God's salt is only as good as the extent to which it generates in us a humane sensibility toward our fellows. If your God doesn't do that, then you need to let your God go. Right? Right, this is Baldwin standing in a kind of critical relationship to the religious object of his faith, in this instance, God. And so I think that many of these thinkers will want to interrogate a form of faith that doesn't open you toward the world, but close you off from it. And I would say that all of the great religious faiths have their fugitive followers that move or understand faith in just that way. But I think whether we're talking about Christianity, Islam, we can find among the vast majority a kind of story that I think aligns with the one that I have defended, the one that I've defended here.
So I have a question, and since, are there any hands raised? I will defer to someone else, because I can always ask Melvin. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming to speak today. So I just wanted to ask a question about something that you mentioned, like Professor Rogers, about like the goal that a lot of these authors had, namely that they're speaking to people who they believe can be transformed and improved. That there's like kind of this assumption of like unsettled like human nature. That the authors want like not merely that their fellows like to hold a vision of a just society, but feel that something about that vision is tied to themselves, and if that vision is portrayed like something about themselves has been portrayed. And in class last semester, we talked about how that connection between self and society can like emanate from what Tocqueville describes as like the social state, right? Like if you're in a democracy, like the state kind of reflects you. And I guess my question is, do you think that these authors are kind of working with that already forged attachment, or are they actually trying to create new attachments? And if so, how do you create new attachments between like an individual and their society that's not already like that's not already created by that social state?
Yeah, no, it's great. I mean, one of the things to keep in mind about these figures is that their vision of political life is an imagined vision, but it is not imaginary. By which I mean that the way in which they sort of cast their vision is pulled from the bits and pieces of a political and social community to which they belong, that they then piece together in a puzzle-like way and project forward as the orienting vision that can guide them, that encourages and disciplines and informs their language, as they then use that language to move others toward that goal. And the reason why I sort of put it in this way, following these thinkers, is because one of the things that they realize is that if they cannot at all find bits and pieces of this imagined world among them shattered, and right, it's not at all clear to them how they would ever be able to get it off the ground and persuade you of it. And so this is one of the reasons why rhetoric matters so much to the constellation of these figures, because they will always meet their audience where they are with their bundle of commitments and beliefs and ideas as the basis for directing them toward a location a destination they never imagined, right? And they part ways with Tocqueville, because Tocqueville, of course, as you know, in Democracy in America, thought that it was possible to get some individual transformation, but Tocqueville was very, very clear, and I think in the chapters on the three races, that it is virtually impossible to have the whole nation rise above itself, meaning the whole polity transform itself into something into something else. And in fact, this is precisely what these thinkers are trying to bring about. And of course you would try if your very being is at stake. If that's what's on the line, you might not think, well, I can throw in the towel with Tocqueville and just think, oh, we can't have this kind of radical transformation. You would think, no, my very status is on the line, so all is on the table, right? So that's what I'll offer to the question there.
That was brilliant. Thank you. I haven't had the pleasure of reading your book yet, so I hope this is relevant. But the other day in one of my classes, we were having a conversation which was a bit truncated by the end of class. And I noticed in your discussion of lynching, and specifically lynching photography, as a vehicle to pursue justice and change the status quo, that you refer to lynching and this violence almost as an aesthetic phenomenon. The notion that we find it like repulsive but also sort of fascinating in a strange sense. And the discussion which I was having in class, which unfortunately I did not get an answer to, is violence, and more specifically terror, an aesthetic phenomenon to some degree? And what do you guys think about that?
Shatema, you want to take that one? I have a thought to it, but because of where you are with your writing in your book, I thought it seemed appropriate.
No, it's up to you.
You sure?
For you, please.
But then say something because it's really relevant. No, right? I mean, it's on point. Well, you all don't know what she's working on, but it's really quite relevant to your work. But I mean, yes, these thinkers most certainly thought so. Part of what they help us to see is the way in which terrorizing bodies, mutilating bodies, is often less about those bodies and more about, and this is sort of central to the trauma literature, I think, is more about, right, the one committing the act in their own identity, right? It is not surprising that in the wake of Reconstruction, with the mass exodus of blacks to the north, and the emergence of captains of industry as inequality is opening up, it's not surprising that white Americans needed to find some way to remind themselves of their powers as new forms of inequality were taking hold of even their lives. And thus black people and terrorizing and lynching them becomes a means to affirm in one's own self a sense of agency and a sense of freedom. That minimally, at least, I'm not like them, right? Shatema?
Yeah. So Wells is a pioneer in anti-lynching, using photography for anti-racist methods as opposed to for terror. But she wasn't the first, and that belongs to her very beleaguered white friend, Catherine Impey, who uses it first. But the thing that I think she brings to it is an understanding that pictures can't speak for themselves, and that they have to be contextualized, and that you have to, and that if it's aesthetic, it can't just be the image alone. And I think that that's an important thing that the NAACP, expressly takes from her, where, they're asked, like, how do we deal with lynching? And they're like, well, there's nothing we can think of that Wells didn't think of. I mean, they just write it down. Yeah. It's in the archive. Yeah. Wow. So, but it is I would say yes.
I think the other thing that you can think about there is also that lynchings were rituals, right? They're performances of a certain kind. So in thinking about them as these kind of aesthetic acts, they're also about the performance of a particular kind of domination that a large number of people can participate in.
I'm gonna ask. Oh, poor Ellie.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I am curious if, Melvin, you could talk a little bit more about the relationship you see between appeals as invoked by the figures your book is concerned with, and commitment. And I'm especially thinking about this question in relation to Professor Winter's comments about the, I mean, you offered it as a reflection, but I wrote down the question, right? How does the narrative of redemption reify the violence of anti-Blackness? And particularly, what I'm seeing here as the relationship between appeals and commitment is perhaps that in appealing, in a Du Boisian way, to the soul of the other, you bind yourself to them, as Baldwin would say, as lovers. And in that love and in your lover's arm, there's a home. And I also think the Afro-pessimists might say, well, what are we committing to, right? And I think you answered this question through your analysis of, like, your contention with the political imaginary. And I'm just curious, it's not a curiosity, I would just love for you to continue to engage Professor Winter's invocations or provocations about, Afro-pessimism, commitment, and appeals, particularly because I think we think about this in our class with Baldwin, about maybe the dangers of committing to something, particularly through this image of the lover, and I haven't heard you talk about that today.
Where are you getting these kids?
So, thanks, Carol. I think so. That's a hard question. So one slice on the question, to sort of restage it a bit, so I can get a hold on it, is that appealing to, and let's say David Walker, is a practice of speaking to an authority that you think can enter in to address the issue at hand, right? So we're familiar with higher and lower courts of appeal in this kind of form, where there's a higher authority to which you can appeal that would enter in to render a judgment. That's a sort of legalistic frame. But there was a frame that was thought to be in the 19th century just sort of endemic to a democratic society as such, right? You could appeal to the great people of Boston. You could appeal to the sensible judgment of the people of Pennsylvania. You could appeal to the heart. In all instances, whether it is the community, the state of Pennsylvania, or the heart, the thought is that it can enter in and render a judgment. And in that process of appealing, you're appealing to those who you also think this issue should matter to them and they should care about it. Right? And there's a worry that in holding out the possibility or constantly holding out the thought that said addressee can be moved, you might bind yourself to those who are constantly looking for your downfall, constantly interested in endangering you. Mm-hmm. So to put it in the language of American political culture, this constant appeal that black people make to the United States is premised on the idea that the polity can be transformed. And it forecloses the thought that you are binding yourself to someone that just simply does not accept you here, or to a people that don't accept you here. And so that the Afro-pessimists are very much concerned about this, because it then generates a kind of, in the black activists, it generates a kind of, I'm going to use this in this way. It's not precisely how Lauren Berlant would use it, but it generates a kind of cruel optimism that recursively, it throws you back on yourself. Okay? Never satisfying the thing you want. Then the next new tragedy happens, and you got Congress people out here thanking people who did not want to die for their death in the service of, I don't want to be a party to any political party's downfall by invoking names, but you got politicians out here sort of speaking in this way. These figures were very much attuned to this. And this is why faith functions to help them manage this. But of course, this is also a group of figures, given the time that they're writing in, this is also a group of figures that also do not see another alternative. So they don't think, so in the 1850s when Martin Delany is making arguments for immigration, Douglass just does not think that's a live issue. Not merely because of feasibility issues, but that matters a great deal to him, but also because he's like, no, black people have given a great deal for this country. This is their home, and there's no reason for us to pick up and go elsewhere. And as we come downstream historically, the idea of exodus going elsewhere becomes less and less and less plausible. So then the question becomes, well, what are you gonna do with those with whom you share this polity, right? And there's always a lumen, as I say in the book, Martin Delany is a placeholder for a kind of Afro-pessimism. And I say that Martin Delany's worry haunts the entire book and the struggle that these figures have embarked upon, because you never get a final response to Delany. Delany could always, across time, point to the sort of eruption of, let's say, police violence vis-a-vis black folks and go, see? This is why Baldwin constantly says throughout his writings, whenever he encounters black people who are in support of black power or the Nation of Islam, he will always say, even as he resists, and Carol, you know this, he will always say, they clearly have the evidence on their side.
Yeah.
Meaning that they can constantly point to the persistence of this antagonism, and then Baldwin will then reach for, love, community, and the like as a way to sort of respond to this.
So, one more question, I think. Diva, you wanna, and then we have a reception outside. We can have snacks and stuff. But this is the last question.
Thank you so much for this talk and this fantastic panel, and Melvin, for your work, which I have always admired in all of its instantiations. And for me, it's confusing. Not because anything that you have written is confusing. You are an extremely, amazingly lucid writer and an arguer. But because I find myself in sharing a certain commitment to pragmatism and a certain distrust, I think, of pessimisms, in a strange position vis-a-vis the argument that you're making, not necessarily about these thinkers, because I think since we're time-bound here, the explanation that you offer for their account, for their own understandings of the nature of their appeals and the basis of their faith makes total sense. But I am interested in that period that Baldwin reaches, that Du Bois reaches, right? That a lot of them reach, right? Where they're like, we tried really hard. I don't think that it's going to work out in this context, right? But I don't think, but I also share your suspicion and I think commitment, right, to the notion that pessimism still doesn't provide us really with an answer there, just provides us with a description, but not anything explanatory in terms of ways to move us forward. So I guess what I'm trying to think about, and I'm really asking you to what your opinion is and to think with me, because I'm trying to figure out what does it mean to have a kind of politics that is based on faith or even hope, right, if hope is a discipline, but is not a redemptive politics. And it may involve atonement for the purposes of repair, but not to sort of reconstruct or reconstitute or right? What if you drop the part? And what if you're interested in construction? What if you're interested in constitution? What if you're interested in world making? What does it mean to embrace a new age, right? With new subjectivities, and how would you do that? And so, I don't know, so it makes me think about perhaps there is a way of mixing the methodologies that you are illuminating, Melvin, and that also that Shatema brings up between sincerity and trolling, between an honest appeal based on persuasion and ethics, but also comedy. And I mean that in like the fullness of that sense, right? A kind of a puckish approach, an approach in which there is a certain tricksterism, in which we sort of cease to, you know, like the old military tactics, where like the old way of the military tactics is like you're both dressed up, you both like have, you know, really like you both dress up in your fine uniforms. You like have a line, right? You're like marching toward each other. Everybody sees everything, right? Like, and this is the way, right, that war is conducted in the West for like hundreds of years. And then somebody's like, maybe we shouldn't do like that. Maybe that's not the best way to do this, right? Particularly if you don't have the balance of weapons on your side, if you don't have all the cavalry on your side, maybe there's a different kind of approach, right? Which then you just like guerrilla approaches, right? It's a different path. So I don't know. I wonder what you think about that, about what it means to approach things, to approach a future in a way that doesn't ask us to recover or redeem, but instead to create.
No, I mean that's a rich question. I mean the only thing I would say to sort of end this is that I think that from Harriet Jacobs to Ralph Ellison with his own notion of the trickster, Harriet Jacobs with her own technologies of resistance that are not akin to Frederick Douglass, those suggest alternative ways by which people were engaged in resistance. But again, even that is drawing from the familiar vocabulary and is working through a familiar grammar of moral and political life. The final thing I would say to this, which I think exceeds what your question is asking, but it goes to a comment, I think, a set of reflections that Lisa offered up, which is that, yes, a great many of these figures arrived at this place of pessimism. And that is, and my thought is that, one, it's striking that it's endemic to black male leadership and not among black women in this regard. So what is that about? And then the second thing I would say is that they forgot the very thing they were calling us to, which is that you bear the burden of resistance and struggle, and you're able to bear it because you're doing it in community. If you imagine yourself as the singular lone figure, as the Bois came to at the end, to imagine how do you shoulder all that? If you imagine that King is that for you, then of course when King is gone, then Baldwin's like, what is there left? What is there left to do, right? And this is the point about what all of these figures are calling us to, which is the importance of community, which helps us bear the weight that inevitably will come as we deal with struggles that bear on our very standing as human beings and as citizens.
So I'll reassume my office and say, join me in thanking the panel and